Back in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Tim. Well, many people across the province currently celebrating, well, maybe just celebrated Easter, maybe celebrating Passover. Anyhow, we thought it was a good time to convene our spirituality panel. Melissa Skelton is the new Anglican bishop of the Diocese of New Westminster. Aasim Rashid is a Mufti, an Islamic scholar and director of religion and Islamic education with the BC Muslim Association. Dan Moskovitz, a senior rabbi at Temple Shalom in Vancouver. All of them with us in studio. Welcome to all of you. How are you?
Wonderful, Stephen. Great to be here.
Very well, thank you.
Great to see all of you. Rabbi Dan, if I can start with you. This time of year, what's on your mind?
Matzah is on my mind. It's Passover, the Jewish Passover holiday, and so we're all eating this very flat, crunchy bread. But the holiday reminds us of the story of redemption of the Israelite slaves from Egyptian slavery and that sense of redemption and coming through difficult experiences to come out onto the other side.
Aasim, for you, what have you been talking about in your recent sermons?
We've been talking a lot about self-reform and trying to create a defined process of self-improvement. That's really what we've been focusing on in our sermons.
And Bishop Melissa, for you, what do you see? I guess what we're talking about here is renewal all around because it tends to be that way in the spring. Is that right?
That's exactly right. What I am trying to focus on is staying in the moment of each of the steps of Christ as Christ walks the path of the deepest, darkest places towards another place of light that will come out of that, and assisting people in just staying with each step of that without jumping to the next.
The idea of bringing you all together is to look at recent events through a sort of spiritual lens, I suppose. And for you, Bishop, what do you see in the news that you can take home to your congregation and say, this is a good lesson to be taught?
What do I see in the news? It would be that the world continues to reflect the disintegration of life in order to present an opportunity for new life. We are not necessarily on the road of progress where everything is just getting better and better, but the rhythm of God in the world is disintegration and the offering of new life within that. And I would say that's true in the political scene with the chaos that we continue to be confronted with in many places in the world. I suppose what I see is continuing invitations to look for the new thing that God is creating in the midst of things falling apart.
Aasim, for you, are you seeing similar teachable moments right now?
I think every time we read the news, there's always a lot of teachable moments. I think it's a clear reflection of ourselves, of who we are and what we are today. If we're content with it, then so be it. And if we're not content with it, we need to reflect on ourselves, how we can change so that the conditions around us can change. And the chaos, as the bishop mentioned, would indicate that we're not doing everything perfectly right, and there's much room for improvement.
A lot of people would look at the news and think we're not doing anything particularly right. You look at the intractable situation in Syria. You look at what's happening in Ukraine right now. Is it appropriate, Rabbi Dan, do you think, to pull those headlines out of the news and to try to see them through a spiritual lens?
Yeah, no, I think so, Stephen. I mean, I think of all of those headlines. I think also of the natural disasters that we've experienced. I see those tragedies, and I see how it seems like the world is sometimes spinning out of control, those man-made and those made by powers greater than ourselves. But I also see the presence of human beings trying to wrestle with those forces of nature and those forces of people and those first responders that rush in. We just had the anniversary of the Boston bombing at the Marathon, and that picture that ran on the cover of the Vancouver Sun of those first responders that were there helping the injured. And I think of those that are on the front lines of trying to help people, even in the midst of what's going on in the Ukraine and what's going on in Syria, and that, you know, what calls people to do that? What causes somebody to rush into the fire, to the earthquake, to be a redeemer, to be a Moses, to be a savior in some way? I think that it is a sense of responsibility towards your fellow human being. And that kind of brotherhood is a tremendously spiritual gift and blessing.
It's interesting because I don't often think of that in a spiritual way. I think of it as somebody being selfless, but they have their job to do and they just rush in and do it, maybe without thinking it fully through or thinking about the consequences for themselves.
That's the best. When it isn't thought through, when it is the impulse out of a sense of unity with another person, it isn't duty necessarily. It's processed through a recognition of the oneness of myself with another person.
Yeah.
Another reason I've been anxious to talk to all of you is because of the result of the Quebec election and the defeat of Pauline Marois and the death of the Values Charter that would ban religious symbols in the public service. Are you unanimously celebrating this, Dan?
Yes. I think that it was quite a victory for those that see their religion as very much a personal thing, don't want to see government or institutions mandating how they can or cannot practice that. As my understanding and reading of the law, it was that it was really not going to achieve even the goals that the Quebec Party wanted it to have, and that it was not going to create this egalitarian society where nobody had their differences, but rather it was building up walls of differences.
Bishop Melissa?
I would like to act as if I'm fully tapped into this, but I'm not. I made a promise to myself I would not act as if I knew something that I do not.
All right. Appreciate that. And I know you're relatively new to the job as well.
6 weeks.
I'm not going to be putting you on the spot.
That's right. No, I wish to be more tapped in, and my focus has been almost entirely dealing with the people sitting before me. Yes.
More generally, do we have no such thing here, of course, in British Columbia, and anybody is free to practice any religion they want in this country. Do we have it right? Because there is that tension between religious symbols, whether it's a kirpan if you're Sikh, whether it's a burqa, whether it's a kippah. Do we have that balance right?
So, I mean, I don't know yet, but bringing from the U.S., the debate about in civic places, could there be religious symbols? Mm-hmm. And I think the world I want to live in is a world in which religious symbols are not banned, in which we learn to accept, not just tolerate, but embrace the multiplicity of voices and an acknowledgement that there is something more abroad in the world other than just those things of our own making.
Awesome.
Just jumping back to the issue in Quebec, I think we all breathed a collective sigh of relief. But going beyond that initial reaction, as I was observing the happenings in Quebec that were surrounding the presentation of that charter, there is apparently in Quebec a large group of people that support that type of thinking. My concern is, where are they going with this? Quebec is very largely looked at by other countries as a hub of immigration. Mm-hmm. Having lived in Quebec for 5 years myself, it's very much Quebec-centric, and that we are different. I mean, a group of us religious leaders looked at this proposal as a small part of the effort to recreate a state within a state or a separate Quebec. It's something that we're glad is over, but I think Quebec society still has a ways to go before they become as evolved and inclusive as the rest of Canada.
Dan?
Well, I was just thinking about this divide that we seem to have in our society between spiritual and religious, and the idea that a spiritual identity is somehow preferred over a religious identity. And I think to see somebody wearing religious garb or symbols that then require them to be adherents to their religious practices, to those values and those tenets in all situations. I mean, I wear a yarmulke to remind me that God sees everything that I do. I want to have people in my society who live by those kinds of standards.
Bishop Melissa?
Again, in the U.S., it gets all involved with politicians using religion as a way to set a tone of exclusion of others. So again, I'm coming at it from a slightly different way.
Is that going to be a difficult adjustment for you coming to Canada? Do we feel like godless heathens here compared to...
Oh, gosh. Gosh, no. Remember, I'm coming from Seattle. And I guess I was saying about the use of symbols of religion as a way of telegraphing political realities in the U.S. is an issue. Mm-hmm. That's not, I believe, what we're talking about. We're talking about the space created for the people to express and to be who they are in the fullness of their identity, to include their religious identity. And that I want to stand by and participate in.
Awesome. Anything to add there?
Just bouncing off something that the rabbi mentioned about symbols. while it's important to uphold the symbols of the various faiths and traditions, people that are adhering to those various faiths need to go a little bit beyond the symbols as well. Mm-hmm. Okay, the symbol is representative of your identity, but that's not the whole substance of the religion. That's just the surface.
Right.
Your life is also a symbol of those teachings that you're displaying outwardly. Nowadays, this is what I'm focusing on with my congregation, that the changes within have to be taken into consideration. The chaos or corruption that we see in the world, it's just us. There is no us and them. It's all us. We're all one body. A person doesn't look at their hand and start insulting it because it's hurting. A person looks at it with an eye of sympathy and says, I need to fix my hand because it's hurting. When human beings look at each other in that view, and we start helping each other, we can effectively change the tone of everything that's going on and perhaps take the edge off some of the animosities that are out there.
Yeah.
Beautifully said.
I don't want to be a bishop now. I want to be an imam.
That's right.
It is so great to see all of you this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Melissa Skelton, the Anglican Bishop of the Diocese of New Westminster, Aasim Rashid, a Mufti, an Islamic scholar and Director of Religion and Islamic Education with the BC Muslim Association, Dan Moskovitz, Senior Rabbi at Temple Shalom in Vancouver. 6 minutes before 5 o'clock on the coast on CBC Radio 1, province-wide this afternoon. Well, King Crow and the Ladies from Hell